You know those car advertisements that say that their new sports car is a race car for the road? And it's usually just based off a touring car or a GT car or just outright lying? Well, Mercedes took a different approach. A very stupid approach that probably made a lot of engineers pissed off for a lot of years. But it's one that is incredibly rewarding when it came to the engineering aspect. They took real Formula One technology and applied it to a road legal car, called the One, like Neo in the Matrix. Mercedes had been building Formula One engines since the fall of Le Mans GT1 back in 1998, and by 2010 they wanted to take the next step. Luckily, one of their engine users, Braun GP, was in need of some cash, and even more luckily, they had just won both F1 titles in 2009. So Mercedes bought out Braun GP, hired Michael Schumacher, and renamed it Mercedes GP. And by 2014, they were a streamlined machine, with Toto Wolff at the helm and one of the best drivers in a generation, Lewis Hamilton, behind the wheel. And the team would dominate the V6 turbo hybrid era to the point of boredom. Out of the 8 years of those rules, Mercedes won 7 drivers' titles and 8 constructors' titles. And while all that was going on, some madmen at AMG had an idea. What if they used their dominant F1 technology on the road? And I don't mean some lessons learned shenanigans for hybrid systems or DRS and things. I mean an honest-to-God F1 spec engine on a road car. But putting F1 engines in road cars isn't really anything new. Before pesky regulations were a thing, early Ferraris had detuned V12s from their F1 program, simply by the name of simplicity. I mean, had to have multiple shops. And vehicles like the 166 Inter launched Ferrari as a car company. But that was also only due to a complete lack of regulations at the time, so the first modern attempt was from Yamaha, of all people. Yamaha's V12s may have powered some pretty terrible teams with some pretty terrible results, but they still wanted to celebrate with a no-expense spared supercar. The 1992 OX9911 V12 was as much of an exotic as that was a terrible name. You sat in tandem with your passenger in a fighter jet-style bubble cockpit surrounded by carbon fiber, and behind you lay a 3.5-liter, naturally aspirated V12, making 400 horsepower. It's an awesome car, unfortunately made right as Japan's economic boom had just ended, and the program was cancelled in 1994 with only 3 prototypes being built. Which means that we would have to lead the charge once again with Ferrari, who launched another F1 spec road car just 1 year later. The F50 was launched to celebrate Ferrari's 50th birthday, kinda, and featured a V12, kinda, from Alain Prost's F1 car that year. But that V12 was a curse disguised as a blessing, since it only made 347 torque, so yes, it was more powerful than its 8-year-old predecessor, the F40, but it was slower because it did not have that turbocharged torque, and compared to its rivals like the EV110 and especially the McLaren F1, it was just in a different league and not in the good way. And that was pretty much it. Sure, there had been test mules and promotional cars like the Porsche 911 Tag Turbo and the Renault Espace F1, but nobody truly got F1 technology to the road without being in financial ruin or a laughingstock by the end of it. Which brings us back to Mercedes. The early 2010s was an exciting few years for auto enthusiasts, with Porsche, Ferrari, and McLaren all producing hybrid hypercars at the same time, and that led the boss of Mercedes-AMG to say in 2015 that there simply wasn't any room for a hypercar at Mercedes for the next decade. But that didn't stop rumors from spreading that Mercedes was indeed building a hybrid V12 supercar in a similar vein to their AMG GT that just launched. They were partially right. That AMG guy was totally lying, and Mercedes was developing a hybrid hypercar behind everyone's backs. Just not based off the AMG GT, and it wasn't going to have a V12. Instead, its engine architecture would get its reference point from the 2015 Mercedes W06 F1 car that won all but 3 races that season. Now, it's one thing to throw an F1 engine into a car and make it drive. It's quite another to make that thing drivable on the road. The biggest problem, strangely, idling. See, F1 engines redline at 15,000 RPM and really like to stay around that point. That also means the engine is tuned to idle at 5,000 RPM or they'll stall out. And funnily enough, having an idle rate that's as high as some red lines isn't viable for a road car that encounters things like stop-and-go traffic, noise limits, and emission rules. It took 9 months of R&D, but AMG finally got the V6 architecture tuned in such a way that it idled at just 1,250 RPM while meeting all of the noise and emission laws, hence the lower 11,000 RPM. But the key phrase throughout that was 9 months. That one problem, admittedly it's a big problem, but still, that one problem took almost an entire year to solve. Which might explain why their new car wasn't unveiled until 2017 at the Frankfurt Motor Show, and why it wasn't publicly driven until 2019. Now, the 2017 unveiling set a 2020 release date, and then the 2019 driving demonstration pushed that back to 2021, and production itself didn't begin until 2021, with hand-built deliveries arriving in 2022. So this car was half a decade in the making, and almost certainly nearly got canceled numerous times due to, again, assuming insanely high development costs and missed deadlines, but the results are pretty spectacular. The engine is a 1.6-liter turbocharged V6 paired to 4 electric motors. 2 normal motors at the front wheels giving 161 horsepower each, 1 MGU-H that recovers thermal energy from the turbocharger to make 121 horsepower, and 1 MGU-K that recovers kinetic energy from the driveshaft to make 161 horsepower. Now combine that with a 566 horsepower internal combustion V6, and the one produces 1,049 horsepower from 1.6 liters of displacement. And ironically enough, that number, 1,049, is almost exactly the same as an actual F1 car. And I say that ironically because the F1 car does that without electric motors on the front axle. But that does give the one all-wheel drive. All-wheel drive, which gives it a 0 to 60 of 2.9 seconds, and a 0 to 124 miles an hour in 7 seconds flat. Now, all of that is heavy at 3,700 pounds, but that weight could have been a lot worse if not for the ludicrous engineering that went into this vehicle. Now, the first one actually seems like a bit of a downside. A really slow, single-clutch, 7-speed automatic gearbox. But a single clutch is lighter, and the slower gear changes don't matter since the car produces so much electric power that the torque from the electric motors keeps accelerating the car through a gear change. Now, everything that isn't made of carbon fiber is then made out of forged aluminum, including the center locking rims and the push-rod suspension. Then there's the aerodynamics, which look a little bit like a fish. That's not an insult. I've actually grown to really like the clean look of this car since I've seen it more and more. But what I mean is that AMG used a long history of evolution and a really fancy wind tunnel to streamline the one as much as possible. But that super streamlined shape is only one of many possible driving modes. There's the super slippery VMAX mode that gives it a top speed of 219 miles an hour, and then there is the other end of the scale, Race Plus mode. Race Plus lowers the overall ride height by 34 millimeters, that's 1.3 inches for us freedom lovers. And then there's the Active Aero. Most cars have moving rear bits. Some really fancy cars have moving front bits. The AMG one has moving front, rear, and middle bits. The rear wing is both an air brake and a drag reduction system, while at the front, there are venturi tunnels covered in flaps that, when open, send cool air into the brakes. And then in the middle, we have the front fenders, which also have flaps that can open up in Race Plus mode to remove pressure from the wheel wells. And also those latter two can be closed for VMAX top speed mode. All of this means that on October 28th, 2022, the One lapped the Nürburgring in 6 minutes and 35 seconds, which is 3 seconds faster than the 911 GT2 RS MR edition. And that's not even its final form, since the track was damp and dirty in some places, so it could probably go even faster. And when I say that, bear in mind that its current time is just 24 seconds slower than the 962 Group C Le Mans car, which held the outright record for any vehicle for 40 years. Now, all of this seems like the most hardcore racer you ever graced the road, but you would be kind of wrong. See, AMG's customers include at least 2 F1 world champions, real estate moguls, a tennis star, and Mark Wahlberg, so they made it a proper car, with air conditioning, touchscreens, a full infotainment system, and even electric windows. Which means it's still the noisiest, harshest 1.6-liter car in history, but you might just be able to hear Deep Purple on the radio at full volume. Not that anybody else could try to experiment with that, since the One cost $2.3 million and all 275 production units were sold out before the first photo was even released. Right now, as of recording this video, Mercedes is still working out the electrical gremlins, and as Top Gear found out, they still have a long ways to go. But the early production reviews all say the same thing. It's not the greatest road car of all time, not even close. It's painfully loud, futuristically fast, strangely well equipped, and profoundly odd. But it's also one of the most impressive engineering feats since the McLaren F1, and that's no small statement.